Hello, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Moore's October Rants. Today's episode is titled, What is Offensive is Subjective. I really wanted to dive in this topic because it's something that comes up all the time in conversations, especially in the world we live in now. We've all had those moments where we're chatting with someone, maybe telling a joke, sharing an opinion, or even just discussing a common topic, and suddenly someone gets offended. And the thing is, it can feel like it comes out of nowhere because what's offensive to one person might be totally fine to someone else. That's what makes this whole thing so tricky. Offense is completely subjective. Every single person is different. Something as simple as talking about religion or politics might be casual for you, but for the person next to you, it could be a huge no-go. Some people avoid certain topics like the plague, while others can engage in them freely without any emotional charge. The challenge is knowing where everyone's boundaries are, and let's be real, you can't always know. There's no neon sign above people's heads telling you, hey, I find this topic really offensive, so don't bring it up. And that's the world we're in now. As time goes on, it feels like more and more people are becoming offended by things that in the past weren't even considered offensive. There's this shift happening in society, and if you were raised in a different era, it can be really difficult to adapt to these new sensitivities. You might find yourself constantly thinking, wait, that's offensive now? And it can be overwhelming because it feels like the rules of what's okay to say are always changing. Take something like gender identity, for example. It used to be that if someone appeared male, you assumed they were male. Simple, right? Not anymore. Now, you could accidentally offend someone by assuming their gender, because the way they present might not align with how they identify. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, we're all learning, but it's definitely made conversations more complicated. There's this added layer of caution, where you're constantly wondering if what you say will upset someone, even if your intention was never to offend. And let's face it, it feels like everything is offensive these days. Every little thing seems to have the potential to trigger someone. And I get it. I talk a lot about how everyone is different in my rants because it's true. People have different triggers, different things that push their buttons. But here's the kicker. Just because you don't like what someone says doesn't mean you have to go out of your way to shut them down. You don't have to engage with it. You can just remove yourself from the situation. This is where things tend to spiral. People nowadays seem to believe that if they're offended, they're automatically right. But offense doesn't equate to being right. Just because something rubs you the wrong way doesn't make the person who said it wrong. Especially when it comes to humor, this happens all the time. Not everyone is going to find the same things funny, and that's okay. Humor is one of those things that's so subjective. One person could be cracking up, and the next person could be offended. Does that mean the joke was inherently wrong or bad? Not necessarily. What I find problematic is when people try to censor others just because they didn't like what was said. Shutting someone down doesn't solve anything. You might stop them from saying something in front of you, but guess what? That person still thinks the same way. You haven't changed their mindset, you've just silenced their words. They're likely going to continue thinking the same way and just say those things when you're not around. So, what have you really accomplished? Nothing. You're addressing the surface issue, the words, but not the deeper problem, which is the mentality behind it. And here's where it can get even more ridiculous. Imagine having to ask someone for a list of everything that offends them before you even start talking. Like you sit down and before the conversation even begins, you're handed a massive list of topics to avoid. How unnatural would that be? Conversations should flow freely, not be scripted or tiptoed around in fear of offending someone. And honestly, if you get offended by something during a conversation, it doesn't have to derail the whole thing. You can simply address it in a calm, respectful way. Saying something like, "Hey, I didn't really like what you said there. Could we maybe change the subject?" is much more productive than getting angry or storming out. The way you approach being offended matters. Unfortunately, what I often see is that people go about it in the worst way possible. They get emotional, they get aggressive, And before you know it, the whole situation escalates. They start calling names, getting upset, and blowing the whole thing out of proportion. And here's the thing, when you approach someone like that, do you really think they're going to change their behavior? If someone is being yelled at, insulted, or treated with disrespect, they're much less likely to do what you want. If anything, they'll probably do the opposite out of spite. I think we need to get better at handling these situations. Being offended is natural. It's going to happen. But how we respond to it is what matters. Trying to shut down every opinion or joke we don't like is not a sustainable way to live. If you don't like what someone is saying, remove yourself. Don't try to control their speech, because that's not really fixing the problem. It's just creating more division. So that's my take on why what's offensive is so subjective. We're all different, and there's no way to please everyone, but we can all approach conversations with a little more understanding and a lot less aggression. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Moore's October Rants. I hope you enjoyed it, and maybe it gave you something to think about. I'm signing off now. Have a good one. Goodbye.